agenda that we'll be covering today for middleware architectures will be review the different layers, review the different components within the layers, and finally review the different configurations that we could have within middleware architectures. To start off with, in a review of the different layers, I'd like to begin by saying, depending on the organizational size, these layers may be made up differently. For small businesses, they can compact and make this layers much smaller than, say, large organizations that run ERP systems. If an organization has smaller organizational requirements or needs and their applications don't reach out to a user base of several thousand, then they can shrink or collapse the components and the architectures into much smaller areas or spaces. The first one we're going to take a look at is a single middleware layer consisting of all the components together. So within this space, we can have our client machine. This is our little PC, and this is our user that we're going to be connecting to our environment with. But within this system, we're going to have everything on a single layer or a single tier. We're going to have our web server. We're going to have an application server, all running together, along with the database. So when we say that an organization with small needs or needs of users are smaller, all this exists on one physical box, one machine. The web server, which manages the connection string, the HTTP processing, or just the calls from the PC into the actual middle tier environment, is handled through that web server or web component. Okay. This feeds then into all the business processing or the application server, which manages all of these are all your applications, logic that's running on the tier itself. Finally connecting or mirroring to your database, which has your data. So all of this existing on one single configuration or one single box. So the components themselves, which we're right here, focusing here, is that web layer or the web server, the application server, and then the database. And again, we're doing separate and distinct functionality within each one of these components. Web server just manages the calls or the communication string from the PC into the middle tier, and then we're going into the application server tier, which is the business logic, and then finally into our database. So that's one of the different configurations that we can manage. The next configuration we want to take a look at, if I could just draw this line here, and I want to put this one in blue to give us a better sense of what this one would be. This would be your traditional three-tiered environment. And that would be with your PC or your client. We'll call that client. Okay. And then here, I'm just going to draw this a little. This diagram will be a little different. We're going to have this broken out into separate pieces. So this will be the web server, which manages those calls again. That's just HTTP. And that could be from a number of different vendors. Okay, this is not vendor specific at this point. This could be from anybody. And then this environment here we get into, and the reason why this is a much bigger area is the application server. Okay. The application server, it works the same way in this environment, the two-tier or the single-tiered environment, managing the business logic. Okay. But here, when we start to get into true distributed environments with, especially in the middle tier area, the servers themselves are really broken up to manage the components much more effectively. So we have, even though this is called the application server, we have business logic running Okay. We could also have reports servers running, and we could have perhaps even some business systems servers running, business intelligence servers running. So we could have a number of different servers inside the application server layer of this block here, or of this component area here. So what we're doing is we're bringing together a number of different components to provide the logic or the business logic back to the end user. And finally, what we'll have down here is the database. Okay. So the database is tied to that application server, and that could be, depending on the configurations there, which we'll get to in much more detail here in a minute, can be a single or multiple databases running. So just to recap on that one, we have the same components, web server, application server, and database server, all running, but they're, instead of being in a single tier, they're on multiple tiers within that application server. We call it middleware, but it's the web server tier, the application server tier, then we have the database tier. An additional configuration where we have an n-tiered configuration. We still have that same client PC, because we still have to make some connection to the system. Going through the web server or HTTP server, just managing the calls to the application server. We have our app server. Okay, and our business logic for our reports and applications, whatever we want to run there. And then we have our database servers running, and these can be multiples or singles, depending on the client's need. Then we could have additional servers running on mainframe systems. Okay, and these can be all tied together or linked together depending on deployment strategies and the need of the client. So again, the components would be the same: web server, application server, database server, and then we bring in a fourth component, is the mainframe servers. Okay, so depending on the configurations needed, the clients would need to determine how appropriate it is to build out the middleware tier in order to achieve the ultimate goal of connectivity from the client PC down to the database or the mainframe system that they're trying to pull data back from. But the configurations themselves really marry all this together regardless of what environment you're in. So in conclusion, what we've done is we have taken a look at the layers, right? We have, depending on the configurations, obviously, because we've got to keep that in mind. Okay, the layers would be web server layer, application server layer, database layer, and if it's a 4-tier model, a mainframe layer. The components within those managing, or the functionality is different. The web server manages HTTP calls. Okay, it's scalable, handles security if needed. Okay, application server handles the business logic. The database server manages data and some business logic, depending on what we're trying to achieve there. And then there's obviously the mainframe server that manages data differently depending on need and if it's legacy systems. Okay. Configurations depend on and vary depending on what client need is. So smaller systems can bring all this together or collapse it and have web server, application server, database server all on one box. Large systems, ERP environments, or systems that require more security or performance or scalability usually break out and build out the application servers and web servers depending on what they need there. So really depending on what their need is, these may change. But ultimately, the components themselves all do the same thing, regardless of configuration.